I will not argue in favor of the introduction of regenerating health in Halo 2. I am a staunch advocate for the fixed health bars of Halo 1 and Halo Reach. But while I do not prefer it, I will not argue it does not work for Halo 2 and 3. Only that a fixed health bar would be better. Regenerating health makes all challenge in the game time sensitive. Once your health regens, your mistake is automatically forgiven. This means the only way to kill the player is to either use weapons that kill them instantly, like the beam rifle or fuel rod gun, or force them into situations where they may take enough concentrated fire to kill them. This is accomplished by the combination of grenades and AoE weapons like brute shots, which force the player out of cover to expose them to enemy fire, with enemies with high TTKs like hunters, elites, and brutes, which force the player to leave cover and put sustained fire on these enemies in order to kill them, simultaneously exposing themselves to concentrated enemy fire as well. Thus, there's a give and take to it. Sure, you never suffer long term for any given encounter that nets you health damage, but you are forced to put yourself in situations where you may very well take a lot of damage at once and die as a result. You can't just peek from behind something and plink at an elite. He'll just pull back behind a piece of cover and regen his shields, and the fight will go nowhere. You have to put sustained fire on him, just like he must to you. You must do enough damage to kill him before he can retreat and recharge. Again, I don't prefer it, but the design logic here makes sense. What doesn't was Infinity Ward adopting regenerating health in Call of Duty 2 like a brain-dead parrot. Regenerating health fundamentally changed the style of combat present in Call of Duty, and not, I would argue, for the better. You know when people dismiss most Call of Duty campaigns as theme park rides or shooting galleries? Well, the regenerating health is one of the reasons this design is, in large part, necessary. To be clear, it is not the only reason it is actually done. I merely mean that if the other reasons for COD campaigns being the way they are went away, regenning health would still push the design in that direction. Because Call of Duty was at that point firmly aesthetically grounded in reality, most of the elements that make regenning health acceptable in Halo weren't possible to include in COD 2. There would be no bullet sponge Nazis with rapid fire rocket launchers and shield generators like some kind of Wolfenstein enemy. The enemies in COD 2 had to remain within the realm of plausibility, which meant dying in 1 to 3 bullets no matter what they were hit with. You can already see the problem. If all the enemies are so easily killed and the player's health regenerates, then the game turns into an endless cycle of pop shot whack-a-mole that the enemy soldiers have no chance of winning unless their accuracy is increased to aimbot levels. The fact enemy soldiers in early COD games were nearly completely fixed to set positions and couldn't move from them except to dodge grenades didn't help. If the enemy can't close in on you while you're camping behind a box waiting for your health to regen, how are they ever going to finish you off? In COD 1, this sort of peak shotting tactic was actually proper play because you had a health bar and a fixed number of health packs per level depending on the difficulty. On Veteran, there were none at all. You needed to be perfectionist with avoiding return fire because it was a permanent decrease in your margin of error for that mission. Playing the same way in COD 2, owing to the enemy AI barely being improved and them being so easily killed, would make you unkillable. The keyword being would. Rather than ditch the health regen, Infinity Ward decided to change other elements of the game's design to compensate for it. Sort of. Giving us two staples of COD design that carried on far into the future: grenade spam and enemy spam. Starting in COD 2, enemy AI had this habit of flooding the player's position with an infinite supply of grenades, which is no doubt why the grenade indicator was introduced at the same time. If the AI has no chance of beating you in a gunfight due to your health regen, then this was the one weapon they can use other than a Panzerschreck, which again would break historical plausibility to give to more than a handful of enemy soldiers. which could force the player out of cover and expose them to enough fire to kill them. As such, they do it constantly. And it often feels as if Infinity Ward didn't fully think through this behavior, as you can end up in situations where the AI continually frags a choke point, preventing the player from ever moving forward until there's a random break in the barrage. Not to mention how utterly artificial it feels to have grenades constantly sailing in your direction whenever you're within throwing range, usually landing nearly dead on unless there's an obstacle blocking the trajectory. The gameplay impact is detrimental in the extreme, as it causes you to spend quite a bit of the game running around like a jackrabbit, dodging grenade volleys rather than actually shooting at anything. Secondly, and compounding the issue, the enemies themselves greatly increased in number compared to enemy counts in COD 1, both increasing the number of grenades being thrown and the volume of enemy fire coming the player's way. The enemy population of COD 1 simply wouldn't do in a game with health regen. They're too easy to individually pick off without taking a lethal amount of damage. So, the devs increase the number of enemy soldiers you face at once by several times over. Where in COD 1, a single house with a half dozen enemies in it might have been, a sufficient obstacle. Now every doorway and every window in a building, inside and out, is crammed with enemies just waiting for you to enter their line of sight. Right? Maps are crammed with troops lined up by the dozen behind every crate, every corner, every sandbag, tree, knocked over piece of whatever. The enemy density is absurd if you actually start to think about it. The effect, again, is tedium. When they aren't spamming grenades at you, the increased numbers don't necessarily kill you any better. They just narrow the window you can afford to expose yourself at once. It means that if you play the game carefully as you would COD 1, you will progress quite slowly owing to how many enemy troops there are around every corner. But it won't per se be more difficult, as there still won't be any consequences to taking hits, so long as you space them out by a few seconds. As such, the satisfaction that comes from clearing a group of enemies without getting hit, as you might feel in COD 1, just isn't there, because there's no penalty for getting hit, and likewise there's no reward for avoiding it. Of course, this assumes you aren't getting assailed with grenades. If you are, then the higher enemy counts turn the game into a frustrating mess, as you constantly find yourself being fragged, then being nearly instantly mowed down by half a dozen troops firing you at once when you move out of your chosen bit of cover to avoid the grenades. How bad this problem is often comes down to the level design. Where it's more linear, this happens a lot, as there's no real leeway in where you can move or where you can take cover. In the missions where the game mercifully opens up the level, which are unfortunately few and far between, it's less of a problem, though the individual bits of the level, such as inside buildings, can still suffer from this problem. Further, to add insult to injury, you could not sprint in COD 2. That wouldn't come till COD 4. As such, not only could you not move away from grenades quickly, but you couldn't cross open spaces quickly, thus increasing the likelihood that any given grenade is effectively a death sentence if it forces you to expose yourself. But what other option did they really have? Without their infinite grenades, the AI would have very little chance of killing you, even on veteran, and even with their inflated numbers. If you play the game on a lower difficulty, where not only do the enemies throw fewer grenades, but are less accurate and do less damage, the game becomes so trivial it might as well play itself. All other options would violate the historical aesthetic the game was supposed to maintain, or required much more effort be put into programming the enemy AI, something that has never been a priority in Call of Duty. The consequence, however, is to make the game far more tedious and, depending on the particular section you're playing, either boring or frustrating. The game oscillates between being a mindless shooting gallery where you mow down hapless enemy soldiers by the dozen without any difficulty, and frag spam kill traps, where you get fragged out and either blown up in the barrage or gunned down trying to escape. The game has very few tricks to throw at you, and you, likewise, have very few tricks to counter it with, making the whole experience mechanically one note. COD 2 is far from the worst offender here, to be clear. COD 4 and World at War were even worse, and Modern Warfare 2 and Black Ops were nearly as bad. But it was COD 2 that introduced this cancer into the franchise in the first place, and I struggle to think of what purpose it served other than to, in pretty much every way, dumb down the game. The player's mistakes are forgiven after a couple of seconds, and to compensate, the hordes of enemies facing them have essentially one tactic they can use to kill the player. All the enemies are exactly the same, apart from what weapon they're holding, but that arsenal is identical across the entire game. They have no complex behaviors and really barely any behavior at all, and the game is mostly linear, so half the time it feels like it might as well be a rail shooter. Now sure, COD 1's enemies were also basically identical, with identical weapons, with barely any AI, but at the very least, the fact each one of them had the ability to permanently punish you for getting hit meant that each one of them was a threat, and could be made somewhat of a novel threat by where they were placed in a level, with what weapon, and how they were placed vis-a-vis other enemies. The level design was how each enemy was differentiated. That shit doesn't matter in COD 2, because they can't really punish you except via grenade spam. So getting caught out of position, taking a hit from not being careful enough, approaching an enemy group from a tactically bad position or angle, none of that matters. You can just hide behind any convenient bit of anything and be back to 100%. Thus, the classic Call of Duty formula was born. An endless year-on-year procession of popping out of cover, mowing down a dozen enemies, having another dozen pop up and toss grenades at you, running away until the grenades stop coming, then running back to your firing position and repeating this process until everyone in front of you is dead. Move up, another horde spawns, repeat. A lot of people look back on CODs from a decade or more ago as if they were so much better than modern COD, but no, they really weren't. They were dumbed down, tedious shooting galleries, and I've never had any inclination to go back and play them. They took a design element from a completely different game with a completely different design and used it without any real thought behind it, beyond the fact it seemed to make the game easier for casuals, and ignored the detrimental effects it had on the other mechanics. Granted, by the numbers, they were right, given COD 4 turned Call of Duty into the money printer it still is to this day, but I'm not about to say appealing to the lowest common denominator is a good design. I will only admit to it being good business, in many cases anyway. Then again, there are so many examples of games succeeding wildly despite not appealing to the lowest common denominator that it comes off as pathetically money hungry, desperate to appeal to as many people as physically possible by making the game as simple as possible. Not that that should be a surprise given who publishes Call of Duty. It's not like Activision has ever been satisfied with merely being wildly successful. If there is any way to squeeze even more money out of people, beyond the gargantuan piles they already rake in, they will do it, much to the detriment of all their IPs.